Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to talk about customers. We'll talk a little bit about customers and market sizing. Then we'll talk about types of customers and understanding the concept of market segmentation. Then we'll talk about two important tools in understanding customers, the persona and the journey map. When we talk about market sizing in relation to planning, we want to recognize that what we're shooting for is to find attractive opportunities. So at a very basic level, big, growing markets are more attractive than small, shrinking, or stable markets. Generally speaking, you want to target segments that can lead to other segments. Your goal here is not to target enormous, complex markets all at once, but to find a very specific segment that the product or service that your venture provides can address very clearly, and then from there move into other related segments. Going after big markets is usually deceptive. It more often than not suggests that you're trying to offer something to everyone, and ironically that very often means that no one will actually want it. A great example of this, the importance of segmentation and having a market entry process is Facebook. You might think, well, Facebook appeals to absolutely everybody. It's one of the single largest user bases in the world, and that's absolutely true, but that's not how it started. If you're not familiar with the story of how Facebook started, I encourage you, it's a great story. The movie, The Social Network, while it's a Hollywood movie, but it actually has a lot of very good information taken from various real documents, lawsuits, and such to tell the Facebook story. Facebook began with a completely different application, and even once it did become Facebook, it was still only available to Harvard students. You had to have a harvard.edu email in order to sign up. And once it was successful there, they took it to the rest of the Ivy League, and then they moved to Stanford and what we might call the extended Ivy League, and eventually made it available to all college students before branching out to the broader population. So as we think about market size analysis for an entrepreneur, what we're trying to do is get a pretty good estimate of how big the market really is. There are two classic ways of doing that, top-down and bottom-up. Top-down analysis means you start with an estimate for how big the entire market is, and then you try to create some guess for what percentage of the market you think you could capture. So if you were, for example, launching a new car company, you might say, well, the total market for cars in the United States is this many $billion, and we think we can capture some percentage of that, and therefore our target market is this size. A bottom-up analysis involves a much more careful look at how many customers you think you can actually reach and how much the price of your product is likely to actually be. And so depending on the type of car that you're planning to produce, you might look at the US population, how many people actually purchase cars of that type, and then you would estimate based on the expected price of the car how big that market actually is. It's really important to recognize that while these are both good processes to go through, top-down analysis is much less effective, and investors and partners will find it much less compelling, usually because the percentage estimates that you generate are not very convincing. We very commonly see entrepreneurs say things like, this is a $20 billion market, and capturing 5% of it should be easy. Well, why 5%? Why not 10%? Very often entrepreneurs will make the mistake of saying, our product is better than everyone else's product, therefore we'll easily capture 5%. Well, clearly, if your product is better than everyone else's, shouldn't you be capturing 90%? And it's those internal flaws in logic that suggest you've really not done your homework. You should be doing sanity checks. Make sure that whatever calculations you generate don't result in numbers that aren't possible. And you should be checking carefully your competition. What does your competition say the market size is? If some of your competition is publicly traded companies, in their K1s, they may actually, or their 10Ks, they actually may state how large they believe their market is. So it's always good to check and see what your competition is saying about the market. So let's be really clear that a customer is someone who pays for your product or service, right? This is really important because very often when entrepreneurs get started, they're under the impression that the user is the customer. For example, you probably use Gmail. or at least you have a Gmail account, but you probably don't pay for Gmail, right? That's paid for by advertisers. So your customer, your consumer, your customer is the one who actually pays for it. A consumer is someone who actually uses it. In the case of toothpaste, you probably buy your own toothpaste and use it. And so you're both the customer and the consumer. But there are other elements of what we might call the decision-making unit: an influencer, a champion, an economic buyer, for example. So an influencer, someone who has an effect on your decision-making process. A champion, maybe if you're an organizational buyer, someone inside your organization who has a specific interest in seeing one product or technology used. The actual person who makes the economic purchase, whether it's on a consumer basis or someone in your organization. Your textbook focuses on user, buyer, and influencer. Those are the key ones you need to know. Be aware that the decision-making unit is often described as being a little more sophisticated than that. A market then is simply a group of customers who make similar purchases, right? The market for sedans, the market for tables, the market for bottled soda. Those encompass a group of customers who are all purchasing something relatively similar. Segmentation is thinking more carefully about those markets in order to come up with subsets. And here's where this gets tricky, and we want to really think carefully about it. At its core, a market segment is a subset of a market, that is a group of customers, who demonstrate similar behavior, right? So there's lots of ways to segment a market, and traditional mechanisms for market segmentation tended to focus on things like sociodemographics: what your income was, your age, where you lived, attitudes, basically these sort of outward characteristics. And the reason that we used those is because they were generally easy to see. You could tell who lives in, for example, Madison, Wisconsin versus who lives in Seattle, Washington. But those are not always compelling examples of what drives purchasing behavior. The best segmentations use observed data to focus on actual purchasing decisions. And this can take you into something like an end user profile of really understanding who these target customers are. A very simple example of this is, in one of my other courses, we have a project where students design t-shirts and then they sell those t-shirts. Well, who's their target market segment? Well, ironically, their target market segment incorporates two very different sociodemographic groups. It involves college students who are low income, tend to be local to Madison, 18 to 22 years old, generally unemployed. And then it also includes 40 to 60-year-olds who tend to have better income, who don't live in Madison. And you might ask, well, what is it why are we saying these are the same segment? They sound awfully different. Well, in fact, these are the friends and family of the students. And the behavioral factor that's in play here is that they like the student, and therefore they're more likely to purchase a t-shirt from them. And this is why the behavioral aspect of segmentation is so much more powerful than the traditional sociodemographics. How do we find an attractive segment? You might remember my comment before about finding attractive markets. Well, we also want to find attractive segments. Again, size of the segment is important. Bigger customer segments are more attractive than smaller customer segments, all else being equal. But then we want to consider the buying power of customers. Do they actually have cash? Are they capable and interested in making purchases? How easily can we actually identify individual customers within a segment? So we might have identified a segment, but now we have to find the actual buyers. How accessible are they? Once we know who they are, can we reach out to them? Can we reach them by email or advertising or phone or whatever? Or can we bring them to a store? And then how stable is this customer segment? Some segments move faster and evolve faster than others. And that doesn't necessarily mean we don't want to target those, but we need to recognize that today's snapshot of the segment may not be viable or relevant in another half a year. This then brings us to another way of thinking about segmentation, which is using the technology adoption lifecycle. So this is often referred to as the technology adoption curve. I'm showing you the version that was adjusted by Jeffrey Moore in his book Crossing the Chasm in order to emphasize this element that's related specifically to entrepreneurship. What we're talking about here is over time, different kinds of customers tend to purchase. So when a new innovation or product is launched, the very first groups are innovators and enthusiasts, and then early adopters and visionaries. And they're purchasing based on excitement. They want something new. They're prepared to pay a little bit more. The vertical axis of this chart is basically represented by the total number of customers or the percentage of the market. And so over time, the goal is to move from these early enthusiasts into the majority of the mainstream market. The problem is that those are pragmatists and conservatives and then ultimately skeptics. These are customers who will not purchase based on hype. They will only purchase when there's a clear cost-benefit analysis. And the problem here is that many entrepreneurs get to the market and they have some early success with innovators and enthusiasts, and they think that they've won. They feel like this is working. And so they continue to use the same marketing, advertising, and processes as before, based on sort of the hype and the excitement. And then that fails for these majority pragmatists and conservatives in the market. And they fall into this chasm, which is the Crossing the Chasm book, which is a fantastic book by Jeffrey Moore. It's strongly, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, highly, highly recommend that book. This is what stops many entrepreneurs from getting to their ultimate success, because they mistake early success in the market with being able to target the mainstream. So we can put all of these factors together in order to generate an end user profile. That can incorporate demographics, such as the characteristics, psychographics, their attitudes. We can look at Proxy Product, what they buy already, and then other elements that your textbook talks about, watering holes, doing a day in the life, biggest fears and motivators, to understand how they think and ultimately how they behave. And again, that's really what's so important about segmentation and this kind of profile, is getting to their behavioral their actual behaviors. So why do we want to use this? Well, using the life cycle framework helps us make better decisions. As I mentioned, the early marketing sales efforts may not work for the majority. In addition, it's important to recognize that the fixed cost of serving majority markets tends to be higher, whereas the variable cost of serving those markets is much lower. The point being is you may have to make a larger investment to get to those majority markets, but there's a reward for it, which is it reduces your variable costs. As I mentioned, many entrepreneurs tend to serve the enthusiast, and then they can't transition. And one of the reasons they tend to lose is because then they're run out of business by a fast follower. Someone who's looked at the market, seen the enthusiasts, realizes that the first entrepreneur has educated the market, and then they slip into the market with, say, a lower priced product that better targets the majority, and they begin winning a much bigger share of the overall market. So niche ventures can repeatedly serve enthusiast markets. That is, you could create a product, serve those enthusiast markets, and then make a new product and reserve those enthusiast markets. But you have to be really differentiated, and you have to generally charge high prices. And there are some spectacularly great examples of that. Apple being just unbelievably good at repeatedly getting those innovators enthusiasts, but realistically, Apple's also become incredibly good at then moving into those majority markets as well. So once you've created that end user profile, you may also want to create a customer persona. A persona is, instead of a generic profile that describes that type of customer, this is an actual person where we imagine, or it may be a fictitious person, but we pretend it's a real person that represents the perfect kind of customer that we want to go after. We do this because it makes it more real, and it can really help your team members address customer needs. This should be based on interviews and data, observations, and so on. There are many factors that can go into the persona, everything that you might imagine that they'd be interested in. And some of this might sound a little bit silly, like because you have to be extremely specific. But doing this really does tend to focus the team. You recognize that this isn't going to be everyone, but it really should be indicative of the kind of person that you're selling to. So let me give you two examples from HubSpot, which HubSpot publishes these on their website to explain the kinds of people they think that they're serving in organizations. One of them is their primary target. They've called Marketing Mary, who's a professional marketer. The other one is owner Ollie, who's the owner of a smaller business, and so that's why he's the target. I'd encourage you to quickly read through these and see how these fit in with the kind of elements that we've just walked through, and notice how compelling these are and how effective they are at showing exactly what it is that this particular technology and innovation serves. One of the last things you might do then is create a customer journey map. A journey map's a visual representation of the customer experience. So it identifies everything that happens to the customer as they're in the process of learning about, purchasing, and then receiving support for whatever it is that you sell them. There's a lot of really powerful benefits of this. It gives you a real clear picture of the customer interaction, or it points out that you don't know exactly what the customer is doing. Helps clarify what the customers think, and it tries to confirm their actual behavior so you can identify high impact moments in their purchasing experience. Sometimes you have to note the difference between what the journey is versus what they'd really like, and that can be a way to find new opportunities based on simply changing not the product but the experience that the customer has. These can be incredibly complicated. This is one that I simply pulled off the web. I've got the link on the next slide for you if you want to see this and others. But the point is that as you become more sophisticated about who your customers are and how you behave, you'd like to put together a purchase journey map like this that shows all the touch points that you're likely to have with the potential customer, what they think is important, and what they're doing at that time. That's how you find those high impact moments that will really make a difference in your ability to sell to customers. This is a great online resource which includes that prior example. It has a whole bunch of other customer journey maps and information about them, which I encourage you to take a look at. So I hope this has given you a little bit of context and some things to think about with regard to customers. We've progressed from sort of the core of entrepreneurship being opportunities into now thinking about how entrepreneurs actually make their opportunities real via an organization, and the customer is the key linkage point in that. You have to serve customers, you have to create value for them.